Right, here we are, ready to read chapters 3 and 4 of Crispin, Cross of Lead. And author Avi got us right into a very interesting, intriguing moment right at the beginning of the story. We find out that this main character, we don't know his name yet, but that his mother has died, and he and the priest are really the only ones in the village that seem to care about her. He had to dig his mother's own grave. There's that. It's just a bad day. He winds up in the woods to be away from it all, get alone. He winds up seeing a meeting that's taking place in the woods. This steward, a leader of the village of Stromford, comes after him with a sword and tries to kill him, and he has no idea why. Yeah, there was a meeting. They were reading a piece of paper, but not much detail there, and so that leads us up to chapter 3. Chapter 3. That life of mine began on the feast of St. Giles, in the year of our Lord 1363, the 36th year of the reign of Edward III, England's great warrior king. We resided in Stromford village with its 150 souls. For as long as I could recall, my mother had simply called me son, and since her name was Asta, Asta's son became my common name. In a world in which one lived by the light of a father's name and rank, that meant, since I had no father, I existed in a shadow. But he, like so many, had died before my birth during a recurrence of the great mortality, often called the plague, or so my mother had informed me. She rarely mentioned him. Nor did she ever take another husband, a circumstance I did not question. It would have been a rare man who would want so frail and impoverished a woman for a wife. For in the entire kingdom of England, there could have been no poorer Christian souls than my mother and I. I had few friends. None I completely trusted. As Asta's son, I was often the butt of jests, jibes, and relentless hounding. "Well, why do they taunt me so?" I once asked Father Quintal during one of my confessions. These confessions were numerous, since I had become convinced there was some sin embedded in me, a sin I was desperate to root out. "Well, be accepting," was the priest's advice. "Think how our blessed Christ was taunted on his cross." I did try to accept my life, but unlike our perfect Jesus, I was filled with caution and suspicion, always expect to be set upon or mocked. In short, I lived the life of the shunned, forever cast aside, yet looking on, curious as to how others lived. There was little my mother or I could do about our plight. We were not slaves, but neither were we free. The steward, John Aycliffe, never lost an opportunity to remind us of the fact that we were villains, serfs, bound to Furnival, Lord of Stromford village. Yet this Lord Furnival had fought in France or had been off to mercenary wars for so many years that most villagers, including myself, had never set eyes on him. It did not matter. Spring, summer, fall, save certain holy days. My mother and I, like every other Stromford villager, worked his fields from dawn to dusk. When winter came, we fed the animals. We had an ox, now and then a chicken, gathered wood and brush for heat, slept, and tried to stay alive. At a time when bread cost a quarter-penny a loaf, the value of my mother's daily labor, by King Edward's royal decree, was a penny each day, mine but a farthing. Our food was barley bread, watered ale, and from time to time some cooked dried peas. If good fortune blessed us, there might be a little meat at Christmastide. Thus our lives never changed, but went round the rolling years beneath the starry vault of distant heaven. Time was the great millstone which ground us to dust like kerneled wheat. The Holy Church told us where we were in the alterations of the day, the year, and in our daily toil. Birth and death alone gave distinction to our lives, as we made the journey between the darkness from whence we had come to the darkness which we were fated to await Judgment Day. Then God's terrible gaze would fall on us and lift us to heaven's bliss, or throw us down to the everlasting flames of hell. This was the life we led. It was no doubt the life my forefathers had led, as had all men and women since the days of Adam. With all my heart I believed that we would continue to live the same until Archangel Gabriel announced the end of time, and with my mother's death, it was as if that time had come. Chapter 4. Following my escape from John Aycliffe and my night of forest hiding, it was the sound of a tolling bell that woke me. Dawn had come, and the Stromford church was announcing early morning prayers, prime. In haste, I made the sign of the cross over my heart, offered up my daily prayer, and listened closely. All I heard was the sound of the bell and muted forest babble, nothing to alarm me. Once awake, however, I could only think of what I'd seen the night before, the meeting in the woods of the steward and the stranger. Nor could I remove from my mind the steward's hateful look when he brought down his sword with the clear intent of killing me. Even so, I tried to convince myself that it would not matter. In the past, Aycliffe had treated me badly. His attack on me the night before was not that great of an exception. Why should he, I told myself, be concerned that I, a nobody, had seen him at his forest meeting? It seemed my best course of action would be to return to my home and act as though nothing untoward had occurred. With the coming of morning's light, it took little to determine where I was. I made my way toward the village. Since my mother had been a cotter, one who held no land in her own right, she and I lived in a one-room dwelling that stood on the far edge of our village, by the northern boundary cross. A thin thatch roof kept out most rain. Earth was our floor. And since it was at some distance from the village, I was able to remain hidden from those who had already gone to their daily labor. I was just about to emerge from the woods and run toward our hut when I caught sight of the bailiff, Roger Kidworthy, and the reeve, Odo Langland. Not only were they carrying pikes and axes, they were headed for my cottage. Unsettled, I drew back quickly and concealed myself behind some bushes to observe their intentions as they entered our small building. Perhaps they were looking for me, because they emerged in moments. But then, to my great shock, they began to use their tools to pull the structure down. The cottage, being of small, mean construction, could not withstand their assault. Within moments, it was little more than a heap of thatch, wattle, and clay. Not content with that, Kinsworthy produced a flint from his wallet and struck sparks and set the place ablaze, the place I had called my home for 13 years. Deeply shaken, I fled back to the forest. As I went, I kept asking myself, why should they have done such a thing? I could not believe it was merely because I'd seen the steward in the forest the night before. Once within the woods, I decided to go to a high rock, which stood near the forest edge and overlooked our village. Though the rock was difficult to climb, I'd done so before on one of my solitary rambles. It was to be hoped that I'd see something to help me understand what was happening. It was not, however, till mid-morning, which I knew by the position of the sun and the ringing of the church bell proclaiming terce, that I reached the rock. Once having made sure I was alone, I climbed. While the rock was not an easy ascent, at some places it was a little less than a cliff, I reached the pinnacle. Once there, I took the further precaution of lying down. Only then did I lift my head and look about. Before me, like some rolled-out tapestry, was my entire world, beneath a sky as blue as Our Lady's blessed robes, a contrast to the greening spring that lay abundant everywhere. Overhead, swallows flitted, free as birds ever are. To the west meandered the river Strom, glittering like a silver ribbon in the golden sun. At this point, the river ran at a shallow depth. Like most, I could not swim, but for much of the year one could wade across. Above and below this ford, depending on the season, the water ran quite deep. A few paces from the river's bank, on the edge of the side, stood one of the stone crosses that marked Stromford's western limit. Covered by mystic markings, this cross had been erected where St. Giles had once appeared. There on the river's low tree-lined bank stood our noble's house, Lord Furnival's manor, the grandest house I knew. It was where the steward had lived for many years in the absence of the knight. With 2 stone walls, 2 levels high, a small window, the manor was to me like a castle, high, mighty, and impenetrable. Inside, I'd never entered, but I'd been told, was an arched hall with a long trestle table and benches, several sleeping rooms, and a chapel. On the walls hung pictures of saints, along with ancient battle shields. The lower level was a large storage place meant for wheat and other foods the village produced. Opposite the manor house, across a road, was the mill. Smaller than Lord Furnival's dwelling, it was built of stout timbers with grinding wheels of massive stone. These wheels were turned by river water, delivered by a run. Not only did the mill grind our wheat and barley at a cost, it contained the ovens where we villagers, by the steward's decree, baked our bread, which required yet another fee. A road led from the river bank. Once a traveler had crossed the river, a road led east and reached another road that ran north and south. Where these roads met, our stone church, St. Giles by the river, stood with its ancient bell. Above and below the church were our dwelling places, some 40 cottages of huts of wattle and daub, thatch and wood, dirt and mud, all in varying shades of brown. North of the village was the commons, where we peasants grazed our own oxen and sheep. Here, too, were the archery butts, where men of age were required, by King Edward's decree, to practice every Sunday. It was also the place where the public stocks and gallows stood. The land for growing crops was laid out in long, narrow strips. One of the 3 strips was planted with barley, another wheat. The final third lay fallow for the grazing of the manor's cattle. As for the 2 roads that passed through Stromford, all I knew was that they led to the rest of England, of which I had no knowledge. And beyond England, I supposed, came the remaining world, Great Christendom, as our priest called it. But in all my life I'd never gone past the boundary crosses, which marked the limit of our village. Everything, from the cottages, the manor house, the meadows, the lands, the commons, even the church itself. The tiny cross behind our cottages used for planting herbs and roots. Everything belonged to Lord Furnival, who held it in the king's name. Indeed, the steward said we belonged to our lord as well. Like all villagers, we were required to ask the steward's permission to be excused from work if ill, to grind our wheat, or bake it, or buy or sell, to travel from our parish, to marry, even to baptize our children. In return, we gained 2 things. When we died, there was hope of heaven, and Lord Furnival protected us from the Scots, the French, the Danes, and the wicked infidels, also known as the Vikings. But that morning I had little doubt I'd never be protected again. Now, if you were following along, you noticed lots of yellow markings on those 2 chapters. Well, those are words that, as I looked back through, I thought, I wonder if kids will know these words. By the way, those pages are just turning accidentally. I'm not sure why. Magic, maybe. But those are words that I thought kids might be less familiar with. Some of them are just period words because it's a book of historical fiction written nearly 700 years ago. But there we have it. That's chapters 3 and 4. We'll see you again.